The summer heat in Beaumont, Texas was merciless that July morning in 2013 when Laura Mitchell kissed her husband goodbye and drove her silver Honda Civic toward downtown. The air conditioning in her car had been acting up for weeks, but like most things in their tight budget, it would have to wait. At 28, Laura had learned to prioritize. The mortgage came first, then groceries, then maybe, if they were lucky, car repairs. She pulled into the parking lot of Henderson Elementary, where she'd been working as a third-grade teacher for the past 4 years. The children loved her gentle way of explaining difficult concepts, and parents often requested their kids be placed in her classroom. Laura had that rare gift of making every child feel seen and valued, even the ones who struggled to keep up or acted out when life at home became too overwhelming. Before we continue with Laura's story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support means everything, and I always enjoy connecting with viewers from around the world. That morning, Laura's closest friend and fellow teacher, Maria Santos, noticed something different about her. During their usual coffee break in the teacher's lounge, Laura seemed distracted, checking her phone more frequently than usual and glancing toward the parking lot through the small window. "Everything okay, honey?" Maria asked, stirring sugar into her instant coffee. The lounge was cramped and poorly ventilated, typical of the underfunded school district, but it had become their sanctuary over the years. Laura hesitated, then forced a smile. "Just tired, I guess. David's been working double shifts at the plant, and we've barely seen each other this week." Maria had known Laura since college, and she could read the worry lines that had been etching themselves deeper around her friend's eyes over the past few months. David Mitchell worked at the ExxonMobil refinery, a job that paid well but demanded everything from him. The chemical smell often clung to his clothes even after he showered, and the stress of the dangerous work environment had been wearing on both of them. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Maria pressed gently. Laura nodded, but her phone buzzed again, and this time when she looked at it, her face went pale. She quickly typed a response, her fingers trembling slightly. "I should get back to my classroom," Laura said, standing abruptly and leaving her coffee half-finished. The rest of the school day passed without incident. Laura taught her students about Texas history, helping them understand the significance of the Alamo and the brave men who died there. She had always been fascinated by stories of courage in the face of impossible odds, though she never imagined she might soon need that same courage herself. At 3:30 p.m., after the final bell rang and the last student had been picked up, Laura gathered her things. She usually stayed until at least 4 p.m. to grade papers or prepare lessons for the next day. But today was different. Maria watched from her doorway as Laura hurried toward the parking lot, her purse clutched tightly against her side. The Honda Civic pulled out of the school parking lot and merged into the afternoon traffic on Highway 90. Security cameras from a nearby gas station would later show the car heading east toward the industrial district where David worked. But Laura never arrived at the refinery, and she never made it home to the small ranch house they'd bought 2 years earlier in the Westfield subdivision. David Mitchell finished his shift at 6 p.m. and expected to find his wife's car in their driveway. When it wasn't there, he initially assumed she'd stopped at the grocery store or maybe gone to visit her mother, who lived about 20 minutes away in Nederland. He showered, changed clothes, and heated up leftover casserole in the microwave, checking his phone for messages that never came. By 8 p.m., real concern began to creep in. Laura was religious about letting him know when she'd be late, especially on weekdays when they tried to have dinner together. He called her cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail. He tried again 10 minutes later with the same result. David drove to Laura's mother's house first, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each mile. Beverly Turner answered the door with flour still dusting her apron. She'd been baking cookies for the church fundraiser, and the hope in David's eyes immediately dimmed when he saw her confused expression. "I thought she was with you," Beverly said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "She hasn't been by here today." They called Maria next, then Laura's sister in Houston, then every friend and family member they could think of. No one had seen or heard from Laura since she'd left school that afternoon. David's voice grew more strained with each phone call, and Beverly could see the panic building in his eyes. "Maybe she had car trouble," Beverly suggested, though her own voice lacked conviction. "You know how that air conditioning has been acting up. Maybe she pulled over somewhere and her phone died." "Huh?" But even as she said it, they both knew Laura would have found a way to call. She would have asked a stranger to borrow their phone, walked to the nearest business, done whatever it took to reach her family. That's who Laura was: responsible, considerate, always thinking of others first. David spent the night driving the route between the school and their house, stopping at every gas station, restaurant and shopping center along the way. He showed Laura's photo to night shift clerks and security guards, his voice hoarse from repeating the same questions. "Have you seen this woman? She was driving a silver Honda Civic. She's been missing since this afternoon." The responses were always the same: sympathetic shakes of the head, promises to keep an eye out, suggestions to call the police if he hadn't already. But David was a man of action, someone who fixed problems with his hands and his determination. The idea of waiting for others to find his wife felt like giving up, and he wasn't ready to do that yet. As dawn broke over Beaumont on July 23, 2013, David finally returned home to make the call he'd been dreading. Detective Ray Johnson of the Beaumont Police Department had handled missing person cases before, but something about David Mitchell's voice on the phone that morning made him pay extra attention. "My wife disappeared yesterday," David said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Her name is Laura Mitchell, and she's been gone for almost 16 hours. Detective Johnson arrived at the Mitchell house within an hour, a stocky man in his 50s with kind eyes and a methodical approach to his work. He'd learned over the years that the first 48 hours were crucial in missing person cases, and something about the circumstances surrounding Laura's disappearance troubled him immediately. "Tell me about yesterday," Johnson said, settling into the Mitchells' living room with his notebook. The house was modest, but well-maintained, with family photos covering every available surface and Laura's presence evident in every carefully chosen detail. David recounted the previous day, how normal everything had seemed when Laura left for work, how she'd kissed him goodbye just like every other morning for the past 6 years of their marriage. He mentioned that she'd seemed tired lately, stressed about money and his long hours at the refinery, but nothing that would explain her sudden disappearance. "Did your wife have any enemies?" Johnson asked. "Anyone who might want to hurt her?" "No," David said immediately. "Everyone loved Laura. Her students, their parents, the other teachers. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel better." But even as he said it, David remembered the way Laura had been checking her phone so frequently lately, the secretive text messages she'd sometimes receive. He'd never been the jealous type, and he'd trusted his wife completely. But now those small details took on a more sinister significance. Detective Johnson interviewed Maria Santos that afternoon at the school. The building felt different with the children gone for summer break, too quiet, too empty, like a stage waiting for actors to return. Maria led him to Laura's classroom, which had been left exactly as she'd arranged it before leaving that final day. "She was nervous about something," Maria admitted, running her fingers along the edge of Laura's desk. "I could tell something was bothering her, but she wouldn't talk about it. Laura was private that way. She'd shoulder the whole world's problems before she'd burden someone else with her own." Johnson examined Laura's desk carefully, looking for anything that might provide a clue. Her lesson plan book was open to the week of July 22nd, with neat handwriting detailing the activities she'd planned for the summer school program. Everything appeared normal until he reached the bottom drawer, which was slightly ajar. Inside, he found a manila envelope tucked behind a stack of construction paper. The envelope contained printouts of text messages, screenshots Laura had apparently taken from her phone. The messages were from an unknown number, and their content made Johnson's blood run cold. "We need to talk today. You know what this is about." "Stop ignoring me. I'm not going away." "Meet me at the old chemical plant off Highway 90 at 4. Come alone or everyone will know your secret." The final message was time-stamped at 2:47 p.m. on July 22nd, less than an hour before Laura had left the school. Johnson immediately expanded the investigation, bringing in additional detectives and requesting cell phone records. The number that had sent the threatening messages was a burner phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store in Beaumont 3 weeks earlier. The store's security cameras had been overwritten, leaving no visual record of who had bought the phone. The abandoned chemical plant mentioned in the final message was located on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex that had been shut down in the 1990s following environmental violations. The property had been fenced off for years, but determined trespassers had cut holes in the chain link, creating multiple entry points. Search teams scoured the facility for 3 days, using dogs and metal detectors to examine every building and piece of machinery. They found Laura's purse in a drainage ditch about a quarter-mile from the main plant building, its contents scattered but seemingly intact. Her driver's license, credit cards, and teacher ID were all there, along with $43 in cash and a tube of lip balm she'd bought just the week before. But there was no sign of Laura herself, and strangely, her wedding ring was missing from the purse. David confirmed that she'd been wearing it that morning. She never took it off, not even to shower or sleep. The simple gold band had been his grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Mitchell women, and Laura had treasured it since their wedding day. The investigation continued through the summer and into the fall, but leads grew scarce as the months passed. David took extended leave from the refinery, spending every waking hour searching for his wife and pressuring the police for updates. The stress began to show in his appearance. He lost weight, developed a persistent cough, and aged what seemed like years in the span of a few months. Beverly Turner, Laura's mother, organized search parties every weekend for the first 6 months. Volunteers would gather at the church on Saturday mornings, armed with flyers and determination, fanning out across East Texas to post Laura's photo in store windows and on telephone poles. The community rallied around the family in those early days. But as time passed and no new evidence emerged, the crowds grew smaller and the hope began to fade. "She's out there somewhere," David would tell anyone who would listen. "Laura's strong, and she's smart. Whatever happened, wherever she is, she's fighting to come home." Detective Johnson never officially closed the case, but after the first year passed without significant developments, other investigations began to take priority. He'd call David every few months with updates that weren't really updates, old evidence re-examined, tips that led nowhere, technological advances that might someday help solve cold cases like Laura's. Years passed with agonizing slowness. David eventually returned to work at the refinery, but he was never the same man his co-workers remembered. He kept Laura's photo on his toolbox and her coffee mug in the cabinet at home, maintaining their small house exactly as she'd left it. Friends suggested he might want to consider moving on, perhaps even dating again. But the suggestions were met with such fierce resistance that people learned to avoid the subject entirely. Maria Santos left Henderson Elementary after 3 years, unable to walk past Laura's former classroom without feeling overwhelmed by grief and unanswered questions. She moved to Austin and found work at a private school, but she never stopped wondering what had really happened to her friend. Every few months, she'd call David to check on him, and their conversations always ended the same way, with promises to never give up hope and commitments to keep searching for answers. Beverly Turner aged rapidly after her daughter's disappearance, her hair turning completely grey within 2 years, and her once vibrant energy diminishing to a quiet sadness that seemed to permeate everything around her. She continued baking cookies for church fundraisers and volunteering at the local food bank, but those who knew her well could see that a fundamental part of her had been broken the day Laura vanished. The 10th anniversary of Laura's disappearance came and went with a small memorial service at the church where she and David had been married. The sanctuary was half empty, filled mostly with family members and a few faithful friends who had refused to let Laura's memory fade. Detective Johnson attended, now grey-haired and nearing retirement, still carrying the weight of unsolved cases like stones in his pocket. 10 years, David said to the small gathering. 10 years of waking up every morning hoping today will be the day we get answers. 10 years of going to bed every night wondering if she's okay, if she's safe, if she knows how much we love her and miss her. His voice broke then, and Beverly reached over to squeeze his hand. They had become each other's primary source of strength over the decade, united by their shared loss and their stubborn refusal to accept that Laura might truly be gone forever. But it was on a humid Tuesday morning in March 2025, almost 12 years after Laura's disappearance, that everything changed. Construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping complex on the outskirts of Beaumont made a discovery that would reopen old wounds and raise new questions that nobody had thought to ask. The foreman, a weathered man named Chuck Rodriguez, who had been in construction for 30 years, was operating a backhoe when he noticed something glinting in the freshly turned earth. At first, he thought it might be a piece of buried metal or maybe an old bottle cap, but when he climbed down to investigate, his heart nearly stopped. Nestled in the dark soil, as if it had been carefully placed there just moments before, was a woman's wedding ring. It was simple gold, exactly the kind that thousands of women wear, but there was something about its condition that struck Chuck immediately. Despite being buried in East Texas dirt for over a decade, the ring gleamed as if it had just been polished. Chuck had lived in Beaumont his whole life, and he remembered the Laura Mitchell case well. His own daughter had been in 3rd grade at Henderson Elementary when the young teacher had vanished, and the disappearance had haunted the community for years. With hands that trembled slightly, he used his cell phone to call the police. Detective Sarah Chen had taken over most of Ray Johnson's old cases when he retired the previous year. She was younger than Johnson had been, with a master's degree in criminal justice and a reputation for approaching cold cases with fresh eyes and new techniques. When the call came in about the ring discovery, she was in the middle of reviewing quarterly crime statistics, but something about the location and circumstances made her drop everything else. The construction site was less than 3 miles from the abandoned chemical plant where Laura's purse had been found 12 years earlier. More significantly, property records showed that the land had been owned by the same corporation that had operated the chemical plant until its closure in the 1990s. The connection might be coincidental, but Detective Chen had learned not to believe in coincidences when it came to murder investigations. She arrived at the construction site within 40 minutes, bringing with her a team of forensic technicians and all the equipment needed to process what might be a crime scene. The workers had been asked to halt their operation, and Chuck Rodriguez stood nervously beside his backhoe, still shaken by his discovery. "Show me exactly where you found it," Chen said, pulling on latex gloves and preparing her camera. Chuck led her to a spot about 15 feet from where he'd been digging when the ring caught his eye. The soil was a mixture of clay and sand, typical of the area, but Chen noticed that it seemed to have been disturbed more recently than the surrounding earth. There were subtle differences in color and texture that suggested someone had dug here within the past few years, not decades ago. The ring itself was even more puzzling up close. Chen had seen plenty of evidence recovered from outdoor locations, and she knew how quickly metal could corrode or become discolored when exposed to the elements. But Laura's wedding ring, and she was already certain that's what this was, looked as if it had been cleaned and polished before being buried. "We need to expand the search area," Chen told her team. "If someone buried this ring here recently, they might have left other evidence." The forensic team spent the rest of the day carefully excavating a 20-foot radius around where the ring had been discovered. They used small tools and brushes, working with the same meticulous care they would apply to an archaeological dig. But aside from some old bottles and rusted metal scraps that clearly predated Laura's disappearance, they found nothing else of significance. Chen drove directly to David Mitchell's house that evening, dreading the conversation she was about to have. She'd reviewed Laura's case file thoroughly since taking it over, and she knew how much David had suffered over the years. Reopening old wounds was never easy, but the discovery of the ring meant the case was active again, whether anyone wanted it to be or not. David answered the door looking older than his 43 years, with grey threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. When he saw Detective Chen standing on his porch, he immediately knew something had happened. "We found something today," Chen said gently. "May I come in?" Adi. David's living room hadn't changed much since Detective Johnson had first visited 12 years earlier. Laura's photos still dominated every surface, and her coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet where she'd left it. David listened in stunned silence as Chen described the construction worker's discovery, his eyes fixed on the evidence bag containing his wife's wedding ring. "I don't understand," he said finally. "How is it possible that the ring looks so new? If someone killed Laura 12 years ago and buried her ring, shouldn't it be corroded or damaged?" Chen had been wondering the same thing. "That's what we need to figure out. David, I have to ask you some difficult questions. Is there any chance Laura might still be alive? Any possibility that she left voluntarily and has been living somewhere else all these years?" David's reaction was immediate and fierce. "No, absolutely not. Laura would never do that to her family, to me. She wouldn't put us through 12 years of hell just to, what? Start a new life somewhere else. That's not who she was." But even as he said it, David felt a tiny spark of something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Hope. If Laura's ring had been recently buried, if it showed no signs of long-term exposure to the elements, then maybe, just maybe, his wife was still alive somewhere. Chen left David's house with more questions than answers, but she was energized in a way she hadn't felt since joining the cold case unit. Fresh evidence meant fresh possibilities, and she was determined to follow every lead, no matter how remote or unlikely it might seem. The next morning, she began the painstaking process of re-interviewing everyone connected to Laura's original disappearance. Maria Santos, now living in Austin, agreed to drive back to Beaumont to meet with Chen. The years had been kind to Maria. She'd married a fellow teacher, had 2 children, and built a successful career at her private school. But Laura's disappearance remained an open wound in her heart. "I've thought about it every day for 12 years, Maria told Chen as they sat in the same coffee shop where she and Laura used to meet on weekends. "I keep wondering if there was something she tried to tell me that I missed, some sign I should have recognized." Chen showed Maria copies of the threatening text messages that had been found in Laura's desk. "Did she ever mention receiving messages like these? Anyone who might have been bothering her?" Maria studied the printouts carefully, her forehead creasing with concentration. "Not specifically, but..." She paused, seeming to wrestle with a memory. "There was something. Maybe 2 weeks before she disappeared, Laura asked me a strange question." "What kind of question?" She wanted to know if I thought people could ever really change, or if we're all just stuck being who we've always been. I thought she was talking about David, maybe some marital problems they were having, but now I wonder if she meant someone from her past. This was new information that hadn't appeared in any of the original case files. Chen made careful notes, then pressed for more details about Laura's state of mind in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She was scared, Maria admitted. I can see that now looking back. She was trying to act normal, but Laura was scared of something, or someone. I just wish I had pushed harder to get her to talk to me. Chen's next stop was Beverly Turner, Laura's mother, who was now 78 years old and living in the same house where she'd received the terrible news of her daughter's disappearance. Beverly moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind was still sharp, and her memory of those final weeks remained painfully clear. Laura called me the Sunday before she disappeared, Beverly said, serving Chen tea in china cups that had belonged to her own mother. She wanted to know about her father's family, specifically about her Uncle Robert. This was another detail that hadn't been prominent in the original investigation. Laura's Uncle Robert had died in a car accident when she was just 15 years old, but Beverly revealed that there had been family tensions surrounding his death that Laura had never fully understood. Robert had some problems, Beverly said carefully. Drinking, gambling, and he'd gotten mixed up with some rough people in Port Arthur. When he died, there were questions about whether it was really an accident. Chen felt the familiar tingle that came when a cold case began to reveal new dimensions. What kind of questions? Robert owed money to the wrong people. A lot of money. And just before he died, he'd been talking about having information that could get him out of trouble. Something about illegal dumping at the chemical plants. The chemical plant connection again. Chen was beginning to see a pattern that the original investigators might have missed, focused as they were on the more obvious angles of Laura's disappearance. Did Laura know about any of this? Not when she was younger. But lately she'd been asking questions about the family history. She said she was working on a genealogy project, but now I wonder if there was more to it than that. Chen left Beverly's house with a growing theory about what might have happened to Laura Mitchell. If Robert Turner had possessed damaging information about illegal activities at the chemical plants, and if that information had somehow come to light years later, it might explain why Laura had been targeted. The next phase of the investigation took Chen into the murky world of corporate environmental crime, where millions of dollars in cleanup costs could be at stake and where people had killed for much less than protecting those kinds of secrets. She requested files from the EPA and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, looking for any connections between Robert Turner and the companies that had operated chemical plants in the Beaumont area. What she found was a web of corruption, cover-ups, and criminal activity that stretched back decades. Robert Turner's name appeared in several witness statements related to illegal dumping investigations, but he had died before he could provide formal testimony. The cases had eventually been settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, but the companies involved had saved hundreds of millions of dollars in potential cleanup costs. More importantly, Chen discovered that one of the key figures in the cover-up was still alive and living in Texas. Marcus Webb had been a middle management executive at the chemical company in the 1990s, responsible for waste disposal operations. According to EPA documents, he had been the person most likely to face criminal charges if Robert Turner had lived to testify. Webb was now 67 years old and officially retired, but Chen's research revealed that he still maintained connections to the petrochemical industry through consulting work. More intriguingly, his cell phone records from July 2013 showed several calls to Beaumont in the days leading up to Laura's disappearance. Chen arranged to interview Webb at his home in Katy, a Houston suburb popular with oil industry executives. The house was impressive, a sprawling colonial on 2 acres of manicured lawn, clearly the home of someone who had profited handsomely from his career in petrochemicals. Webb was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of tan that comes from spending time on expensive boats. He greeted Chen with the polished courtesy of someone accustomed to dealing with investigators, but she noticed his hands shake slightly when she introduced herself as a detective working on the Laura Mitchell case. "I'm not sure how I can help you," Webb said, leading her into a living room decorated with hunting trophies and corporate awards. "I never knew Mrs. Mitchell personally, and I was living here in Houston when she disappeared." Chen pulled out a copy of Laura's uncle's EPA witness statement and placed it on the coffee table between them. "But you did know Robert Turner?" Webb's composure slipped almost imperceptibly. "That was a long time ago. Robert was troubled. He had problems with alcohol and gambling, and he was always looking for someone to blame for his misfortunes. According to these documents, he was prepared to testify that you personally ordered him to dump chemical waste in unauthorized locations. Testimony that could have resulted in criminal charges against you. Robert Turner was a liar and a drunk," Webb said, his voice hardening. "His death was a tragedy, but it was also an accident. He was driving under the influence, and he lost control of his vehicle." Chen watched Webb carefully as she delivered her next piece of information. Laura Mitchell had been researching her family's history in the months before she disappeared. "We have reason to believe she may have discovered information related to her uncle's death and his connection to the chemical plant investigations." For the first time since Chen had arrived, Webb looked genuinely surprised. "That's impossible. All of that happened when she was just a child. There's no way she could have known about Robert's involvement. Unless someone told her, someone who wanted to use that information for their own purposes." Webb stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked his backyard pool. When he turned back to face Chen, his expression had changed completely. The polished executive was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and frightened. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "That whole situation with the chemical plants, the illegal dumping, Robert Turner's death, it was bigger than just one company or one cover-up. There were people involved who would kill to keep those secrets buried." Chen felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment in every investigation when the case either broke wide open or hit another dead end. "What people, Mr. Webb? I can't tell you that. Even after all these years, I can't tell you that. But I will say this. If Laura Mitchell really did discover something about her uncle's death, then she was in more danger than she could have possibly imagined." Webb refused to say anything more, despite Chen's continued questioning. But as she prepared to leave, he called out to her from his doorway. "Detective, that ring you found, you said it looked like it had been recently cleaned and polished." "That's right." Webb nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Then Laura Mitchell might still be alive, and if she is, she's been hiding for 12 years for a very good reason. Chen drove back to Beaumont with her mind racing. Webb's final comment had opened up possibilities she hadn't seriously considered before. What if Laura hadn't been murdered 12 years ago? What if she had discovered something so dangerous that she'd been forced to disappear, to fake her own death in order to protect herself and her family? The recently buried wedding ring suddenly made more sense in this context. If Laura had been living under an assumed identity for 12 years, she might have decided to leave behind this final piece of her old life, perhaps as a signal to her family that she was still alive, or as a way of finally letting go of the past. But if Laura was alive, where had she been for 12 years? And why now, after all this time, had she chosen to surface by leaving behind her wedding ring? Chen's investigation took on new urgency as she began exploring the possibility that Laura Mitchell had been living under a false identity. She contacted the Social Security Administration, requesting information about any new identities that had been created around the time of Laura's disappearance. The process was complicated and time-consuming, but Chen had learned patience during her years working cold cases. Meanwhile, she returned to the construction site where the ring had been discovered, hoping to find additional clues that the original search might have missed. The construction company had agreed to halt work on that section of the project while the investigation continued, and Chen brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan for any other buried objects. The radar revealed several anomalies in the soil, including what appeared to be a metal container buried about 4 feet below the surface, roughly 10 feet from where the ring had been found. Chen's team carefully excavated the area, working slowly and documenting every step of the process. What they found was a weatherproof storage container, the kind used by campers and outdoors enthusiasts to protect valuable items from moisture and animals. Inside the container, wrapped in plastic bags, were items that made Chen's heart race. A driver's license issued to Sarah Johnson with Laura Mitchell's photograph, a savings account passbook showing regular deposits over the past 11 years, and a handwritten letter addressed simply to David. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter, knowing that she was about to read words that could solve one of the most mysterious disappearances in East Texas history. Laura's distinctive handwriting was unmistakable, even after all these years. "My dearest David, if you're reading this letter, then something has happened to me, and the people I've been hiding from have finally found me. I know you must have spent years hating me, thinking I abandoned you and our life together. The truth is so much more complicated than that. I never wanted to leave. I never wanted to put you and Mama through the pain of not knowing what happened to me. But I discovered something about Uncle Robert's death that put all of us in terrible danger.